They couldn't understand how a single-engine fighter had reached Berlin and come back again. The fuel math said it was impossible. The range, the weight, the fuel burn, it didn't add up. Yet there it was, the wreckage of an American P-51 Mustang lying half-buried in the frozen soil of northern Germany. March 1944. Rechlin Airfield. Snow drifted across the test grounds as Luftwaffe engineers surrounded the captured aircraft, the most complete example they had ever seen. The pilot was gone, but his flight chart survived, still clipped to the kneeboard in the cockpit. Debden, England, Berlin, return. The route line curved across all of Germany and back again. A round trip of more than 1,100 miles. For months, intelligence officers had insisted that no single-engine fighter could escort bombers that far. They'd built the Reich's defensive strategy on that belief. Fighters like the P-47 or P-38 could barely reach the Ruhr before fuel starvation forced them home. But this Mustang had fought over Berlin itself and nearly returned to base. Oberst Hermann von Bombach, head of aircraft development, led the examination personally. He ran a gloved hand over the wing root, tracing bullet holes and burn marks. The Packard-built Merlin engine, a copy of Britain's Rolls-Royce design, still smelled of hot oil and high-octane fuel. Instruments were frozen mid-flight. The clock stopped at 12:42. Technicians drained what remained of the tanks, 2 in the wings, 92 gallons each, and a newer fuselage tank behind the cockpit, holding 85. Total, 269 gallons. At a cruise burn of 70 gallons per hour, the Mustang could fly just under 4 hours. That gave it maybe 1,100 miles. Barely enough for the trip, with no allowance for combat. Yet Gallen's combat reports described P-51's dueling over Berlin for 20 minutes or more before breaking off, still climbing, still fast. They weren't limping home on fumes. They had reserves. The numbers made no sense. Unless there was something missing. Under each wing, the engineers found reinforced fittings, fuel couplings, cleanly sheared. External stores, clearly. But these weren't the usual aluminum tanks the Allies had used before. The diameter and line width suggested something larger, much larger. That evening, dispatch riders arrived from Brandenburg with debris collected from the same engagement. 2 strange silver cylinders recovered almost intact from frozen fields. They were long, smooth, and unnervingly light. Each one could hold 100 gallons or more. The engineers assumed they were aluminum until one technician scraped his knife across the surface. Instead of metal, the blade lifted fibers, layers, compressed sheets, paper. For a moment, no one spoke. A fuel tank, made of paper, had carried this fighter to Berlin and back. The Allies hadn't just built a better plane. They had built a better idea. The fragments arrived at dawn, carried into the Recklin hangar on a frost-covered tarp. 2 cylinders, dented but intact. They were smooth, almost polished, painted in a dull silver that flaked away under the engineer's gloves. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, external fuel tanks, nothing new. But when Oberst von Bombach ordered them placed on the scale, the readings silenced the room. 80 pounds. For a tank that size, it should have been at least 120 if made of aluminum. He tapped the surface with his knuckles. The sound was wrong, muted, hollow, almost wooden. A junior engineer brought a knife and scraped away a line of paint near the tail cone. A gray-brown dust fell to the floor. Underneath, not metal grain, but texture. Layers. Fibers pressed together so tightly they formed a seamless shell. The tank was made of paper. One man laughed, nervous, involuntary. The others stared, unwilling to accept it. They dissected the first tank carefully, cutting it open lengthwise. Inside, they found 12 distinct layers of heavy craft paper, laminated with a resin that had hardened into an amber-colored shell. Wooden baffles crossed the interior to prevent fuel from sloshing. Brass fittings gleamed at both ends, precision machined, perfectly sealed. And inside, a thin film of lacquer, likely cellulose-based, designed to resist aviation fuel. A paper tank, holding 108 U.S. gallons. 2 of them would give the Mustang an extra 216 gallons, raising total capacity to nearly 500. At 70 gallons per hour, that meant almost 7 hours of flight, 2,000 miles of range, enough to cross Germany twice and still fight. The numbers now made sense. The mystery was solved, but what it revealed was more disturbing than any secret weapon. Germany's entire aviation industry depended on aluminum, steel, and magnesium, all rationed, all scarce. Paper was worthless. Yet the Americans had turned it into a strategic material. These tanks could be produced in any paper mill or packaging plant by semi-skilled labor. No rivets, no welding, no precious metals. Heat, glue, and pressure were all that was needed. Von Baumbach lifted one of the paper strips to the light. The resin caught the glow like amber. "This is not desperation," he murmured. "It's efficiency." Intelligence officers recorded every detail: length, diameter, weight, adhesive composition. Samples were sent to Berlin for chemical analysis. Reports estimated that if even 1% of America's paper output were diverted to tank production, the Allies could manufacture over 100,000 units per month. Disposable fuel tanks. Each used once, jettisoned in combat, forgotten. By noon, word spread through Recklin's corridors. The Americans had solved not just the range problem, they had solved production itself. In a single innovation, they'd freed their fighters from metal and from scarcity. When the day's test log closed, one note appeared in the margin, written by a junior engineer in pencil. If they can make fuel tanks from paper, what else are they making this way? By the end of that week, the report from Rechlin had reached Berlin. It moved through the chain of command like a quiet explosion. First disbelief, then alarm. The Luftwaffe's intelligence section reviewed the data twice, searching for error. None was found. The Americans had created disposable fuel tanks out of paper, cheap, light, and limitless. The implications went far beyond aviation. At Luftwaffe headquarters, General Adolf Galland read the summary with a cigarette burning to its filter. He'd seen these Mustangs over Berlin, flashing silver in the thin spring sunlight, diving and climbing as if fuel were infinite. Now he understood why. They were not defying physics. They were drowning it in production. For 4 years, Germany had fought a war of precision, a struggle for perfection. Every Messerschmitt, every Focke-Wulf, every Daimler engine was a work of art built by craftsmen. Perfection took time. Time Germany no longer had. And now the enemy had shown that perfection wasn't necessary, only abundance. The Rechlin report circulated through the Reich Air Ministry with notes scrawled in the margins. Improvise equivalent? Substitute wood? One memo proposed producing similar tanks from pressed fiberboard. Another suggested reverting to glass fiber. Too brittle, too costly. None of the proposals reached production. There was no capacity left to adapt. Engineers who had once mocked the crude shapes of American bombers now studied them with unease. They began asking forbidden questions. How many factories did the Americans have? How much aluminum? How many workers? The answers were crushing. In 1944, the United States produced over 1.2 million tons of aluminum, 5 times Germany's best year. Its paper industry alone could build 1,000 tanks a day without affecting civilian supply. And because each tank was single-use, The Americans didn't need to recover them. They simply made more. Meanwhile, German production depended on dwindling bauxite imports, bombed rail lines, and skilled labor that no longer existed. Every new Messerschmitt that rolled out of Augsburg cost the Reich 2 weeks of labor and materials that could never be replaced. Gallen's private notes from March 1944 captured the despair of that realization. We build for durability. They build for replacement. Their strength is not in the air, but in the factory. Every hour, a new machine. Every hour, another chance. At Rechlin, von Bombach ordered the paper tanks preserved as teaching tools. When new pilots arrived for briefings, they were shown the crushed cylinders beside the captured Mustang. The message was clear. The enemy could now reach anywhere in Germany. The old strategy, waiting for escort fighters to turn back, was dead. By April, the Luftwaffe was fighting a different kind of war, one it could not win. Not a war of skill, but a war of manufacturing. And the first blow had come from something no one expected: a fuel tank made of paper. The effect was immediate and merciless. By April 1944, the skies over Germany had changed color, silver contrails stretching unbroken from the Channel to Berlin. The bombers no longer flew alone. From dawn to dusk, the roar of Merlin engines echoed over the Reich. The paper tanks had turned the P-51 Mustang into something new, not just a fighter, but an occupation of the air. American planners wasted no time. Missions once thought suicidal were now routine. Schweinfurt, Leipzig, Berlin. Beyond them, the refineries of Silesia and the aircraft plants at Regensburg. Every target once shielded by distance was now exposed. Mustang groups launched from English bases, formed over the North Sea, and entered German airspace with 2 108-gallon tanks slung beneath their wings. An extra 216 gallons of fuel, nearly doubling range. At pre-planned points, they dropped the tanks, lightened, and went to full combat power. For the Luftwaffe, this was annihilation in slow motion. Fighter controllers at Gießen, Magdeburg, and Rostock watched radar screens fill with hundreds of blips, escorts that didn't turn back. At 25,000 feet, Messerschmitts climbed to intercept and found the Mustangs already waiting for them. The defensive strategy built over 4 years to attack bombers once their cover peeled away disintegrated in a single season. At Rechlin, the paper tanks became a grim exhibit. Crews examined their laminated shells, now scarred by bullets and exhaust burns. A technician joked bitterly, "They make fuel tanks from paper. We make excuses from steel." Nobody laughed. Reports from the front were turning desperate. Loss ratios told the story. In February, German fighters still inflicted damage. 1 bomber downed for every 2 interceptors lost. By May, the ratio had reversed. 5 German aircraft destroyed for each American lost. The Luftwaffe was burning through its last aces. When the 8th Air Force hit Berlin on May 24th, the escorts followed the bombers in, fought for 30 minutes, and still had fuel to strafe airfields on the way out. Ground observers described the nightmare in their diaries. Silver P-51s diving from cloud banks, engines howling, exhausts glowing orange. "They stayed for hours," one mechanic wrote. "It was as if the sky belonged to them." Inside German factories, morale cracked. Workers saw the raids growing heavier, the defenders fewer. Even engineers began to grasp the deeper meaning of the paper tanks. They were a declaration that America could afford to throw away what Germany could barely build. That summer, as production shifted to defend the Reich, the Allies had already achieved what no weapon could have promised: air permanence. And the quiet realization spread through every Luftwaffe command post. The Americans hadn't just reached Berlin. They were never leaving. By midsummer 1944, the crisis had a sound. The rising thunder of hundreds of Merlins above every German city. The air raid sirens no longer came in waves. They were constant, a background hum to a nation under siege. Fuel, pilots, engines. The Luftwaffe was bleeding from every vein. And at the root of it all lay something so absurd the German officers could barely say it aloud. Paper fuel tanks. At Jagdgeschwader headquarters in Magdeburg, field reports piled up faster than they could be read. Pilots were describing combat encounters that defied logic. They escort the bombers over Berlin and chase us to the ground, one squadron leader wrote. We engage at 30,000 feet, and they follow us to treetop level. Always more of them. Always with fuel, the airfields told the rest of the story. Between March and July, the Reich lost over 2,000 fighters, not to bombing, but to combat. The replacements arrived slower, the pilots younger. Many of them barely knew how to use oxygen systems, let alone survive a turning fight with a Mustang. Training hours had fallen from 250 to under 100, sometimes less than 50. Meanwhile, the Americans were producing P-51s faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down, nearly 600 per month from Inglewood and Dallas combined. The Allies were now escorting every major bomber formation, every day the weather allowed. To German fighter control, it felt like drowning. At Rechlin, Oberst von Bombach's technical unit became a morgue for the Luftwaffe's illusions. They examined new wrecks weekly, FW-190s and BF-109s shredded by .50 caliber fire. Engines melted from overboosted dives. We designed perfect machines, he told his staff one night, and they built enough imperfect ones to bury us. The crisis spread beyond the skies. With aviation fuel production collapsing under Allied bombing, remaining stocks were rationed to elite squadrons. Ground crews siphoned fuel from damaged aircraft just to keep a few serviceable. The irony was cruel. The Reich was starving for gasoline while the Americans were throwing paper tanks full of it into the sea. Even morale, once the Luftwaffe's last fortress, began to crack. Intercept squadrons reported Jabo fever, fighter-bomber panic. Pilots became physically ill when ordered to scramble. They knew what waited for them: endless contrails, the roar of supercharged Merlins, and gun flashes that looked like lightning. On July 18th, during a briefing near Augsburg, Galland spoke quietly to his surviving commanders. "Our war in the air is lost," he said. "We can still fight bravely, but we cannot fight endlessly." No one argued. By the time the meeting ended, another raid warning echoed outside. The men stepped into the sunlight, shielding their eyes as silver dots glimmered overhead. Still coming, still climbing, still fueled by tanks made of paper. In late July 1944, the corridors of the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin fell silent. Not because the bombs had stopped falling, but because the reports arriving from Rechlin, Augsburg, and the front left no argument standing. For the first time, Germany's engineers began to speak the word that had haunted their briefings for months: unwinnable. The final analysis of the Mustang's paper drop tanks landed on Oberst von Bombach's desk that morning. It was more than an engineering report. It was a revelation of national scale. Page after page outlined not only how the tanks were built, but what they represented: mass production without limitation. Each tank took less than an hour to manufacture. The materials, craft paper, phenol formaldehyde resin, cellulose lacquer, were sourced from everyday civilian supply chains. They required no aluminum, no steel, no skilled machinists. Any paper mill could make them. and America had hundreds. The calculations at the end of the report were devastating. If just 1% of U.S. paper production had been diverted to this purpose, the Americans could create 100,000 tanks a month, enough to equip every fighter group on Earth, then discard them after each mission. Germany, by comparison, couldn't produce enough aluminum tanks to equip even a single Jagdgeschwader for sustained combat. Von Bombach read the last line twice before setting the report down. This innovation reflects not technical desperation, but industrial confidence. It demonstrates that the United States can wage war indefinitely. He looked out the window toward the gray Berlin skyline, where black smoke from a recent raid still hung like a second horizon. It wasn't just the tanks, he realized. It was the philosophy behind them. German design worshipped perfection. Every joint hand-fitted, every screw polished. American design worshipped output. Fast, repeatable. Good enough to fight and built fast enough to replace. The Rechlin engineers held their own briefing that afternoon. On the table lay two artifacts, a crushed paper tank and a recovered section of a Mustang's wing. This, von Bombach said, pointing to the tank, is how they reached Berlin. Then he tapped the wing, smooth and standard in every rivet. And this is why they will not stop at Berlin. Across the Reich, similar moments of realization were unfolding. Factory supervisors knew their quotas were impossible. Air staff officers knew their tactics were obsolete. Even the most loyal pilots sensed that courage had become a currency that no longer bought survival. In a private memo circulated to senior command, Galland summarized what the Recklin findings had made painfully clear. Their genius is not mechanical. It is organizational. They have turned imagination into an assembly line. The truth was no longer technical. It was existential. Germany could outfight, outthink, and outfly individual enemies, but it could not outbuild America. The revelation at Rechlin did not stay in the laboratories. Within weeks, it reached the airfields, passed from engineers to flight instructors, from instructors to the young men still willing to climb into cockpits. By late summer 1944, even the newest pilots understood the truth before their first mission. The Americans would not run out of fuel, of planes, or of men. At Jagdgeschwader 54 near Paderborn, 20-year-old Lieutenant Karl Kruger watched a briefing officer roll a silver-painted cylinder onto the table. The man rapped on it twice. "This," he said, "is why they can reach Berlin." Paper and glue. The laughter that followed was thin and nervous. Everyone had heard the stories, but seeing the object up close was different. It was light enough to lift with one hand, yet it had carried a Mustang halfway across Europe. When the officer cut it open with a saw, the smell of gasoline still clung to the layers. The room fell silent. That silence was spreading everywhere, across air bases, across strategy meetings, across the once brash confidence of the Luftwaffe. The pilots still fought with courage, but their courage was being spent faster than Germany could replace it. On August 6th, Kruger took off with 10 others to intercept a daylight raid heading toward Hanover. Climbing through 30,000 feet, they saw the contrails first, hundreds of them, weaving like white scars across the sky. The radio crackled with calm American voices, guiding bomber boxes into formation. Then came the escorts, P-51s shimmering like mirrors in the sun, breaking from the bombers and diving straight toward them. Kruger never saw the Mustang that hit him. Only the staccato flashes of 8 machine guns and the sudden shudder of metal tearing apart. He bailed out at 12,000 feet and watched the sky below him turn silver with fighters. Later, in his debriefing, he could only whisper, They were everywhere. At headquarters, Galland read similar accounts from every front. The pattern was clear. Every sortie ended the same way. The Luftwaffe outnumbered, outclimbed, outlasted. Even victories meant nothing. For every Mustang destroyed, another appeared the next week, factory fresh, flawless, already fueled. Among senior staff, the question shifted from how to win to how to survive. The air war had become a mathematical certainty, and every German pilot could feel it. Some still believed in miracle weapons, jets, rockets, new tactics, but most knew the truth. The miracle had already happened, and it belonged to the enemy. That autumn, von Bombach stood beside the wreck of yet another Mustang, its paper tanks scattered like discarded shells across a field. He picked one up, crushed it in his hand, and turned to his aide. "They build tomorrow faster than we can finish today," he said. "That is the real weapon." By the winter of 1944, the silence inside Germany's aircraft factories was louder than the bombers overhead. Conveyor belts stopped mid-cycle. Cranes hung still above half-finished fuselages. What remained of the Luftwaffe's production lines had become museums of failure. Each machine a monument to a vanished idea. That precision alone could win a war. At Rechlin, the once bustling proving ground became an archive. The paper tanks, carefully labeled and preserved, were now teaching exhibits for visiting officers who came not to test, but to understand why they were losing. Oberst von Bombach still gave the same demonstration. He'd place one of the light silver cylinders on the table and strike it with his hand. "This," he'd say, "is what victory sounds like. Quiet, disposable, infinite." The phrase spread like a rumor through the officer corps. Quiet, disposable, infinite. It described not only the paper tanks, but the new shape of American warfare. While German plants struggled to produce a few hundred aircraft a month, North American aviation and its subcontractors were delivering one Mustang every 2 hours. In January 1945 alone, 881 new P-51s rolled out of their factories. The Luftwaffe's total operational strength had fallen below 1,000 fighters for the entire Reich. On the front lines, the transformation was complete. Bombing missions that once required elaborate planning now launched daily. Mustangs ranged freely from England to Czechoslovakia, cutting rail lines, strafing airfields, hunting locomotives. Each mission ended with the same ritual. The pilots jettisoned their empty tanks over enemy territory, hundreds of them falling like metallic leaves across the fields of Saxony and Brandenburg. Farmers later recalled seeing those strange silver shells littering the countryside, light enough to roll in the wind. Children would collect them, unaware they were touching the remnants of the moment their nation's fate had been sealed. Inside the Reich Air Ministry, the final strategic reports spoke the language of defeat. Aluminum output down 40%. Fuel stockpiles below critical. Pilot training reduced to 40 hours. The words "sustainable operations" were crossed out in red ink. Galland's last directive to his surviving group commanders was brutally simple. Engage only when certain of advantage. Save the pilots, not the planes, but there was never an advantage left to take. Every sortie now meant facing an enemy who arrived in endless succession, each plane carrying the same humble miracle of paper and resin that had erased distance itself. By February, even the engineers stopped analyzing. There was nothing left to measure. Germany's factories could no longer build faster than the sky could destroy. And as von Bombach packed the last of his files for evacuation, he paused by the display case holding one of the original tanks. The silver coating had dulled with age, but the layers beneath were intact. He touched it once, almost gently. "It wasn't the fuel that beat us," he said. "It was the idea that you could throw perfection away and still win." Spring 1945. The war that had begun with the roar of engines was ending in silence. Allied bombers no longer met resistance over Germany. The once formidable Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Squadrons reduced to names, pilots to memories. And among the relics the Allies found in captured airfields, one object appeared again and again: the thin, silver-painted cylinders that had changed everything. At Rechlin, American technical officers catalogued what was left of the Luftwaffe's research archives. When they uncovered the German analysis of the P-51's drop tanks, they paused. The pages were meticulous: fuel calculations, material samples, photographs, but what struck them was the final paragraph. In von Bombach's careful handwriting were the words, "This is how a nation without fear of loss fights a war." That line became a quiet legend among Allied engineers. It described not arrogance, but freedom, the industrial and psychological ability to build, discard, and rebuild without hesitation. The Americans had not invented paper tanks because they had to. They did it because they could. In post-war interrogations, surviving German officers often returned to that detail. They spoke less about tactics or technology and more about tempo. "You built faster than we could decide," one engineer admitted to an American counterpart. "Every time we found an answer, you had already moved on to the next question." The paper drop tank was the perfect metaphor for that tempo. Cheap, simple, endlessly replaceable. It turned logistics into momentum. And momentum, in 1944, was deadlier than any weapon. When von Bombach himself was questioned after the war, he offered no defense, only analysis. "The Mustang," he said, "was not extraordinary. But the idea behind it was, we tried to save everything we built. You built as if everything could be replaced. You were right." In Washington, those words reached industrial planners who would later shape the post-war boom. The same logic that had produced the paper tanks, standardization, expendability, and scale, would become the foundation of an entirely new age. The jet engine, the computer, even the space program would follow the same rhythm: design fast, build faster, perfect later. For Germany, the lesson arrived too late. The nation that had worshipped craftsmanship had been defeated by a nation that worshipped production. And somewhere over the ruins of Berlin, the contrails had long since faded. But their meaning endured. The war's engineers left behind their machines, their charts, their calculations. Yet the simplest artifact of all, a fuel tank made of paper, had told the entire story. It proved that victory wasn't only about who fought harder. It was about who could afford to fail more often and learn faster. They had stared at the wreck of a single fighter and asked a simple question: how had it reached Berlin and come back again? A year later, the answer filled the skies. The Mustang's range had not only changed a battle, it had rewritten the meaning of war. Behind every pilot and every engine stood the real force that carried them across continents: an idea that innovation was worthless unless it could be multiplied. After 1945, that philosophy outlived the war itself. The same men who had built paper tanks turned their attention to the peace that followed. Their methods shaped a generation: factories that could retool overnight, production lines that could move from aircraft to automobiles, assembly systems that would soon send rockets beyond the atmosphere. For historians, the paper tank became more than a curiosity. It became a symbol of a civilization learning that flexibility beats perfection and scale beats elegance. A few layers of resin and craft paper had exposed the limits of an empire built on craftsmanship. In post-war Germany, the surviving engineers of Rechlin rarely spoke of it, but the lessons stayed with them. One of them, years later, was asked what the discovery had felt like. He replied, "It wasn't shame. It was clarity. We realized they were fighting a different kind of war, one we could never join." The Americans themselves rarely remembered the paper tanks in their victory parades. They were too ordinary, too disposable to celebrate. Yet it was their very ordinariness that made them decisive. They had turned raw industry into endurance, and endurance into inevitability. Every Mustang that roared eastward carried more than bullets and fuel. It carried proof that an idea, when made simple enough to repeat, could become unstoppable. And so, when the German scientists at Rechlin scraped away that layer of silver paint and found paper beneath, they weren't just uncovering a secret. They were witnessing the moment their future vanished, replaced by something lighter, faster, and infinitely more abundant. Opening Paradox answered, they couldn't understand how a single-engine fighter had reached Berlin and come back again. Now they knew. It wasn't the pilot. It wasn't the engine. It was the factory.